Excellent. All right, so hello everybody. Welcome to this Safer Dance Spaces event. This is an event that is open to everybody, so not only to SDS members, but it has been advertised online for anybody really to join. And the reason for this is effectively we are really keen on awareness and education when it comes to the topic of creating safer dance spaces, and the awareness with regards to sexual abuse. What does it mean, and how can we effectively prevent it and avoid it in our communities? So we really wanted to open this to as many people as possible in the dance scene globally. So hopefully we'll have people joining from all over the world, and hopefully people are changing their names to say this, or I see some people are putting this in the chat. So we have people from the UK, Germany, USA, and I'm sure many more are joining. Before we start introducing the session, I'm just going to go through some of the practical ways as to how this is going to run. So as I said earlier, you are all muted as participants. This is not because we don't want to hear you, but because we want to avoid background noises, etc. if people get unmuted by mistake, because we are expecting quite a big attendance to this. So hopefully more than 50%, more than 50 people have registered, sorry. So hopefully we're going to have an attendance that is round about there. But we do very much welcome your feedback and your participation, which is why there will be some polls through Zoom. We are also at some point going to use Mentimeter, which is also an interactive tool. And we are going to have, after the workshop session, just an open Q&A. And the way that we're going to facilitate that is effectively through reading your questions in the chat. So please drop your questions in the chat as and when they come. If they are particularly pertinent to something that is being said on the moment, we may interrupt the presentation, but we're going to try not to. And we're going to try to take Q&A at the very end of the session. But we have enough time for that, don't worry. So before we start with the meat of the session, I'm going to quickly introduce myself and the other members of the steering group. So my name is Laura Tabbitt. I am based in London, UK. I am one of the founders and steering group members of Safer Dance Spaces. I'm a social dancer, so I don't organize or teach, but I've been in the dance scene, salsa and kizomba primarily, samba bachata, for over a decade. My interest in safer dance spaces and in this topic has really been there for a while. So I am one of the founders of the NGO Climb Against Sexual Abuse, who is the the sponsor for Safer Dance Spaces. And I use to champion the zero tolerance campaign that Climb Against Sexual Abuse ran in the dancing scene a few years ago, and which is all online. So I've been really keen to see Safer Dance Spaces grow globally, and I am very happy to see you all today, and I'm going to be your host for today. Angel, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Hi everybody, I'm Angel. I'm based in the UK, London. I also run a dance event, a dance organisation, Urban Kids UK, Kids Lounge and Unity. I've been involved since the very start, actually, 2020. So I was one of the original people in the group that started to come up with the initiative and the ideas, which then became SDS. And I'm here mainly just to support, and obviously Tim and Valeria, they've basically done an amazing job putting this together. This is a bespoke workshop just for us, basically, but we were shared some of his research and we thought it was really useful and something that we really wanted to educate and publicize much more widely, hence the reason why we've decided to put this workshop together. So yeah.
Thank you, Angel. Sonia, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes. Hi, I'm Sonia Kizomba. I'm a Kizomba instructor and organizer based in Brussels in Belgium. And I'm part of the steering group of SDS since beginning of this year.
Thank you, Sonia. So now you know who the SES steering group members are, and I'm going to move on to introducing our fantastic guests today. So we have two presenters who are going to take you through the research. As I say, please make sure you use the chat for any questions as we go through. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Timothy Clancy. So Tim has spent 2 years in Afghanistan. And after returning from there, he shifted his career to focus on reducing violence and instability. In 2016, he volunteered at an international multi-thousand-member gaming organization, where he conducted nearly 80 investigations on harassment, toxicity, and sexual assault over the next 3 years. So Tim brought a system thinking perspective and a rigorous analysis developed countering radicalization, terrorism, and insurgent violence in all its forms. He knew it was hard enough to mitigate the harm of bad actors exploiting the communities they exist within. So to personal relationships, formal and informal hierarchies, power imbalance, all of these things really complicate the effort of articulating all of this. Tim is a volunteer investigator who learned that the problem only gets harder in volunteer-supported community efforts that don't have the resources or the full-time staff of larger organizations. So this is the case of a lot of our dance communities, really. So since then, Timothy has helped his underserved space with research, presentations, and workshops to educate on the risk factors and how harassment operates as a system rather than an incident. So today we really want to focus on this system thinking and this systems reasoning rather than talk about specific incidents. By seeing the forest and the trees, organizations can leverage those systems to work for rather than against their efforts to make the community safe for members, participants, and volunteers. Tim holds an MSc in simulation science and insurgency dynamics and a PhD in system dynamics, focusing on the life cycle of violence and instability of non-state actors. He's a former chief methodologist of IBM. So we really have quite a strong academic background here trying to present for us today. And Tim is joined today by his partner in research, Valeria Stevens. Valeria is a research analyst. She's working alongside Tim at Dialectic Simulations Consulting on complex simulation modeling and national security topics. In addition to that, Valeria has spent 7 years as an advocate in different volunteer communities working to counter toxicity, harassment, and sexual assault. Valeria holds a BA in political science from McGill University in Canada. Thanks a million, Tim and Valeria, for joining us today. We are really looking forward to hearing your research and actually to participate in it through the polls and during the interactive bits of this workshop today. I'm going to hand over to you, Tim and Valeria, to start this session.
Thank you, Angel, Laura, and I appreciate the welcome from Laura, Sonia, and Angel, and the SDS board. We really appreciate the opportunity. For those who have joined, I know it's a worldwide audience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're going to get a quick overview of where we're spending our 2 hours. It's a fairly loose schedule, but there's two main sections we're going to present on. Valeria is going to start off with a quick safety briefing. Section 1 is going to focus on risk factors and pathway to harassment. Then we're going to take a break. We don't want to have people in their chairs too long, so there will be a break. It's going to be close to the bottom of the hour. Then we're going to do the second section, which is on systemic abusers and some quick ideas, how to address risk. And then, as mentioned, we're going to go into some facilitated questions. Now, we're going to provide a lot of information today. Any one of these topics can be gone deeper and further into, but what we're trying to do is give a good grounding on where the research is and how this relates to the dance community. So we're going to hand it over to Valeria for the safety briefing.
Hi there. The safety briefing is going to be very brief. I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that the topic we will be discussing involves sexual assault, sexual harassment, but also the nature of the problem in systems and handling it. Individuals may find this material challenging or triggering. And from personal experience, I also want to flag the fact that sometimes it's not just the details of an individual incident, but it's how the community handles it that can be re-traumatizing. So I want you to be mindful for your own well-being and to take whatever steps you need to make yourself comfortable and feel safe. There's absolutely no shame in taking a break. As you know, this is recorded, so you can come back to the topic later if you really want to focus on it, but you have to take it in bite-sized chunks. You are the best person to know where your boundaries and limits with material like this is. And I also want to emphasize that if you've been in a volunteering role where you've been working with this, you may also be vulnerable to being triggered. So don't think just because it hasn't personally happened to you, you aren't also at risk of being triggered by the material we're going to work with.
Thanks, Valeria. And to get us started, first to think about, the first thing we want to talk about today is risk factors and the pathway of harassment. And the first exercise, people are joining in, they're kind of logging in. What we want to do is a two-part engagement. So this is going to consist of sort of where you are at the start. What do you think of as risk factors? How frequent do you think they are in your dance communities? And you could be a participant dancer, a coach, an organizer for events, nationally recognized dancer. We've got all sorts in here, but we want to get a baseline of what you think. So this is going to become in two parts. There will be, I am launching a Zoom poll right now, and this is going to appear on your Zoom. This is going to ask you about the frequency, what you perceive as the likelihood of harassment or sexual assault in your dance spaces. And again, these polls are sort of, notional. You can put very likely, likely. Neutral means either you have no opinion or you don't sort of want to express one now. Unlikely, feel free to put it. The polls are anonymous. We are capturing this information. And then Laura, if you want to share the fill in the blank poll, I'll go ahead and relinquish the share to you. There we go. Do you want to walk us through this, Laura, or do you want me to?
No, all good. So everybody, you can see at the top of the screen a code. So if you can, please go to www.menti.com and enter this code that you can see at the top of the screen. For some reason, I can't see it because I have this Zoom band. So if anybody can read it out, it'd be great.
It is showing up.
It's
Excellent.
35965955. I'll put it in the chat as well.
Excellent. And what we want to hear about from all of you is effectively to brainstorm some of the risk factors you associate with harassment and sexual assault. So, I mean, a few of you have probably learned this session just because you want to know the answer to this. So you potentially don't have it just yet in your mind, but it'd be good to hear your thoughts about what you thought this might be. So effectively, what do you think could make sexual abuse in your community more likely or more severe? I mean, those of you who are already SDS members, you will have undertaken the induction. And as you know, our aim at Safer Dance Spaces is effectively to understand this problem a little bit more, understand what sexual abuse is, what it looks like, learn to recognize it, learn to intervene. So hopefully this means that you'll have a few thoughts about this. But even just, this is not an exam. This is also going to be anonymous. So we have two answers now. I'm gonna start showing these quickly. And it's really just to get your thoughts as to why, we have this question often. Why is it different in the dance scene? Surely this is just society and that's it. Why are we looking at this more specifically? What makes it any different? So just throw your ideas, and I think you're allowed to put in more than one contribution. So those are showing up on the screen for everybody, but I'm not going to close this poll. So while Tim continues to speak, please feel free to continue adding to those, and we will get back to those later on in the workshop. So please continue to type on Mentimeter, and Tim, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you. So to get us started, we talk about risks, and already you saw there's a lot of different risks. One of the key things we want to get across in today's workshop is that there is no one risk. It is a combination of risks and a system of risk. And a lot of people are like, well, what can I do? Like, how do I process all this? How am I supposed to operate? It seems there's so many things going on, so many potential risks. And if there's a basic premise that we try and get across when doing these presentations is that as you accept risk, you increase your obligation to act. And so we use this little sample graphic that if you look at it, it's a balance, right? And on the left, the more risk factors you add on the left. So we're going to go through a bunch of risk factors, but it's probably impossible to eliminate all of them. And that's okay. You may not want to for certain reasons to say, look, I'm willing to accept this one. But the key thing is, as you add risk on the left, the obligation to act on the right goes up. This isn't unusual if we think about any sort of activity that may be dangerous. If I'm looking at going to a pizza parlor for a birthday or jumping out of a plane, right? The inherent risk of those activities are different. And the obligation, we expect the pizza parlor or the parachutist in the plane, we expect them to take that risk differently, and that's okay. So as you go through this, don't think I have to tackle all these things all the time, all at once, but do understand as we accept more risk, that obligation to act goes up. And this is why I'm thrilled to be here today with Safer Dance Spaces, because they're giving you these tools to help with that obligation. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to tackle it alone. So just keep this in mind as we go through some of the risks. And we're going to start out with, sort of the research approach. I've done a lot of research. My background, as Laura mentioned, I did a lot of work with the Department of Defense. I spent 2 years in Afghanistan. Part of that was researching sexual assault and harassment in the Department of Defense, and doing that gave me a good grounding on sort of the literature. I've also been involved in gaming organizations, so I keep track of harassment in gaming and toxicity. My current research on radicalization and extremism, these things do overlap. So there's a basis of research where we can say, what are these risk factors? And they fall into 4 large categories. The first is demographics. That's who's involved. And as I mentioned, it could be participants, coaches, event organizers. Everyone in the community has a demographic, and that's one element of risk factor. But then that community itself, the environment, what is the community? What constitutes it? What's its cultures? What's its norms? Those two. Then we get into some of the things that really enable harassment and assault. And we're going to go over constantly opportunities for powers over other. I already saw in Mentimeter one of the things about disparities in perceived power. Almost all harassment and toxicity arises from this perceived power imbalance. So this is a real key one. And then finally, barriers to reporting. That may be cultural, it may be procedural, it may be social. But these 4 categories interact in a system. You heard Laura mention that we look at this as a system of harassment. None of these are in isolation. None of these that we're going to talk about exist in their own. They all exist in this combination of factors that combine and often make it overwhelming to say, what can I do? So what we want to do first is sort of ground everyone in the literature of what these risk factors are and where they come from. So let's start off real quick with the demographics, right? So when we're talking about demographics, there's 3 key risk factors in this. And this is talking about the members of the community, or if you have a large dance organization, this may be within your organization itself. We're being flexible here because we know we have folks from all different backgrounds and participatory experience, but large organizations have these demographics, communities have these demographics, hobbies have these demographics. So don't think of this as just what's at the dance studio, but think of it broadly in the field or the style of dance that you do. Obviously, I'm not an expert on dance. That's why we have Laura, Sonia, and Angela here. But the 3 risk factors are the prevalence of at-risk members, the nature of a social organization, and regular newcomers joining. So walking through the research really quickly, at-risk members, there is a distinct difference based on age and circumstance. And if a member or a participant is 18 to 34 years old, or a member of a vulnerable population like LGBTQT+, they have a significantly higher risk of being subject to harassment, toxicity, sexual assault. This does not mean that there's no risk for men. This does not mean that there's no risk. It's all about perceived power imbalance. So everyone can be a target and can be a victim, but the prevalence of risk increases as you have younger members or they come from vulnerable populations. And we'll get into some of why this is. When you think about you're starting out, you're new, you're young, you may not have the experience of navigating some of these areas. That's not a burden on them. That's on. Let me unmute myself. There we go. All right. So the part of this risk is social organization. So as a dance community, you're in a really unique spot. And this is why I spend a lot of time with volunteer organizations. When I worked at the Department of Defense, or if you go to a university or you go to a Fortune 500 corporation, they have large, dedicated, full-time staffs that work with this. And I'm not saying it's easy for them. They still have lots of problems. But they can also say, look, this is your work. and keep your work at work. We're going to put in certain place rules. But social organizations blend that line between work and hobby and social. And the real challenge is that when we look at how assault happens, we tend to have this myth of the stranger danger. This came out of the 1980s, that the people committing these sexual assaults and harassments, they're in trench coats, they're lurking off at the side, you can recognize them, they look kind of sketchy. That's not really true, right? 80% of sexual assault victims, they knew their abuser as a friend or an acquaintance before it happened. So when you have these organizations that by their very nature are social, you want to make friends, you want to dance, you like dancing, you like people who enjoy the same passions and hobbies you do, it increases that risk because now it's not just a coworker, it's not just someone you meet periodically in the hallway, it's not a stranger that you need to worry about walking down the street, it's someone in that social organization. And as we get further in the presentation, you'll see that the existence of a social organization also creates a social network. It's one thing to have something happen at your work and be able to say, well, that's work, and I have my support network outside who are going to support me. In these social organizations, your support network is the same one under accusation, and that creates a lot of complexity. So really, I want to highlight this social organization, and the final part of these demographics are regular newcomers joining. This is something that most people tend not to realize at first, but the research shows consistently, and this comes from studies at universities, when I was working at the Department of Defense, newcomers coming into a community, that first 6 to 24 months is especially vulnerable for them because they don't understand the social structure. They don't understand the formal and informal power hierarchies. They don't really have a good sense of confidence of self. They may not be connected to the whisper network. So in the military, this is new members to a unit. You could be a 10-year veteran of the Army, but you join a new unit and your risk factor goes up. At a university, this is why we often see the highest rates in freshmen and sophomores. They're new to the university environment. This goes broadly. Anytime you are entering a new social organization, that period of transition leaves you vulnerable for some of these things, and that's why the risk factor goes up. Well, I don't know, you can know your own dance community, but some of these things we're talking about, you want to be able to offer. You want to be able to offer dance to newcomers. You want to be able to recruit. Your business may depend on it. So having this creates a challenge because you can't just say, well, we're going to stop accepting new members or we don't want to grow dance. That we're never saying that that's the solution. What we're saying is, as you accept these risks, understand your obligation to act goes up. If you target and market to younger members who may be newer to dance, and you have social things, that may be very good in many circumstances, but what you're doing is you're accepting a slightly higher risk than other organizations. And this is where we talk about that balance. It's never cut and dry. It's never very easy, but understanding the balance. So the next one, environment, is what are the risks in an existing environment? And this gets into, there are a few risks here. Alcohol at events. This is something that across the literature, it's commonly understood, but not the details. So 50% of all sexual assaults are associated with alcohol. That's true. But the misnomer is they often think it's the victim who is the one consuming alcohol. When you break it down into the abuser and the victim, it's actually 75% of the time it's an abuser who is consuming the alcohol, and the victim is only 25% of the time. But this manifests in two ways. An abuser will often, even if they consumed alcohol, say, well, it wasn't my fault, I didn't know what I was doing. Or they'll try and pass it off that, look, no weapon was used, like this wasn't a crime, I didn't use a weapon. But the other challenge is if someone is a victim and they were using alcohol, this opens them up to all sorts of unfair questioning, if there's any inaccuracies or inconsistencies. The second factor, prevalence of aggressive and sexualized language or display. This is really tricky. If you're at a workplace, you can say, obviously, we're not going to do any sexually suggestive imagery. There's no office romance. You can set policies and expect them to be followed. But, we see this in gaming communities. We see this in theatrical communities, acting communities. Sometimes the content you're working with is by its very nature sexualized. It may have sexualized language. It may have performative aspects. The problem with this is when you have, it's called priming. When you see these acts, men, and this is not individual men, but generally speaking, men become more tolerant of sexual harassment in an environment that is primed with sexual and aggressive language. This isn't, again, it's not saying all men do this, but it is just a general factor. The more aggressive and sexualized language, even if it's part of a performance, the more this creates a risk factor. You may also, because you're a social organization, people like each other, they get to know each other, they have romantic pursuits. Healthy consensual romantic pursuits are not a bad thing in a social organization. But if I'm a workplace, I can say no office romances and just set a rule. And that way I know there's no gray area. However, in a social organization, there's always going to be this gray area where some people are engaging in long-term relationships, short-term relationships. If it's consensual and healthy, that's not a problem. But if that behavior goes on, it elevates this risk level of sort of priming the environment. Hostile environments. This is very different. It's, you know, there's a difference between, you can have a perfectly safe environment that embraces and uses sexualized language and does that within a safe, consensual way. But hostile environments is when unwanted sexual advances, remarks, and pressures for dates. So if people see others who got together romantically and they think, oh, this is now a meat market, I'm going to go ask every woman or partner or man that I'm attracted to for a date. I'm not going to take no for an answer. This is the difference between a safe environment and a hostile. Unwelcome conduct, unwelcome advances. The final one here is the mixing of dance and non-dance spaces. This is one we see in a lot of groups we work with. The groups will have formal areas within which their events are held. It may be that a dance has a dance floor, right? It has a specific area if you're in a hotel for an event that is official space. But you also are a social organization, and those social activities spread out from the dance location. It may be a restaurant you go to after the dance. It may be a hotel where people are staying. The distinction between dance and non-dance spaces, most 70% of sexual assault and violence doesn't occur in very obvious public places for obvious reasons, right? It's not going to necessarily occur on the dance. It can occur on the dance floor, but it may be in a hotel room. It may be somewhere adjacent. But the thing to remember is that everyone is there because of the dance event. Your responsibility doesn't end just because it didn't happen on the dance floor. It can happen somewhere else, and you need to be open to that risk of, as you blur those lines, that risk goes up. So the two up to this point, demographics and environment, are really talking about a lot of communities, right? Now we're getting into specific psychographic factors that deal with that perceived power imbalance I mentioned earlier. Anytime you have opportunities for power over others, you see these risk factors arise. Again, my background with the DoD, you have military commanders who can give orders, who can determine careers, academics, professors who can determine whether someone graduates or the grade they get. Even workplace, this is where, you know, workplaces struggle. Supervisors, they have supervisory power. But the power doesn't always have to be formal and discreet. Like a military commander is a fairly formal, discreet form of power. But what I want to get you in your head here is that power exists in many different forms. And I imagine there's a lot of them in the dance community that may exist without even having formal titles or ranks like a military. So these four are community cachet, high status positions, the existence of excessive force or mechanics in the dance, and high power positions. So let's walk through these real quickly. Community cachet, it varies by every social organization, but there's always something that determines who's the celebrity. Maybe they're the best dancer. Maybe they're nationally recognized. Maybe they've won awards. Maybe they're just the person who volunteers a lot and everyone really appreciates them for supporting. Hey, they helped put on the event. That cachet gives power over others. It may not be definitive in terms of like someone who has that power is definitely going to abuse it, but it is a risk factor because you've now created an informal mechanism of power in your dance community, which is equivalent to being a rank in the military. The high status positions, you know, you could be a teacher, someone, an advanced dancer. If in your dance community, you put this ascribed status to certain roles, national event organizer, assistant to the national event. And again, I'm not making any dispersions on anyone in specific. I'm saying these are what we mean by high status positions. Even a local studio that has no international connection, but there's one dance coach who is the master of the studio, so to speak. That is a high status position relative to the people in that studio. The hierarchy of these, the closer to the top you are, whatever that status is, the more opportunities for power you have over others. Therefore, the risk goes up. So someone who is a teacher position may be have more opportunity for powers than someone who works at the front desk as a volunteer. Understanding those high status positions is important to understanding the relative risk. Excessive force and the mechanics of dance. This one often represents in different areas, but anytime you have something where you're physically guiding another person, you may be holding them in an embrace or using their limbs for a lift. And again, I'm obviously not a dancer, so I'm careful here with how the terminology, but anywhere you are using physical conduct to guide someone, and it could be said, hey, that's just part of the dance, right? I'm doing a lift. This is part of the dance, right? Those create opportunities for abuse. But it might also be verbal dominance. It's a performative act. And sometimes in plays and movies or scripts, you get into scenarios where there may be some sort of verbal dominance. Even if it's part of a script, again, remember, this all goes into the environment. So dance has a long history and a long culture that is an entirely different topic to get into, but it inherits all these social cultural mechanisms that may come from earlier times. You just need to be aware about how these force mechanics are used, both verbal force and physical force. The final one, high power positions. This is tricky because if you think about power in a volunteer community, someone has their real life position. Maybe they have a low status position, their perception of themselves. They have a low status position in their everyday lives. But when they get in the dance community, because they volunteer, because they're a great dancer, they get a temporary high status position. So this creates, the research shows if you traditionally see yourself in a low status position, but through some community you're involved in, you get some sort of high power attribution, that increases the risk that you're going to act in an inappropriate way, just like people who have truly high power positions. We saw this in gaming, for example. People who ran games maybe didn't necessarily have high power in their everyday lives, but when they were running that game, they were like the dance coach. They were like the event organizer. They had the power in that limited situation. And it's that imbalance between I perceive myself as having low power. And let's face it, these days, who isn't worried about rent, job, my first job, my second job, all those things. But if you get into a dance community and you have high power there, suddenly this becomes an additional risk factor because it's called supervisory power. Think about anywhere in dance where anyone can instruct someone to do something and expect it to be followed. You know, can you go get me some chairs? Can you go grab that tote? Can you do your dance again this way? These are high power positions because they have supervision implied in them, even if it's not a manager or a supervisor in a work. Okay. The final one of these is, and I saw some of these, I was glad to see these in the poll, is the barriers to reporting. So far we've talked about the people, we've talked about the environment, we've talked a little bit about the culture. This deals with what are your processes and methods, not just do you have them, but how are they implemented? So lack of training and resources, fear of retaliation, and fear of negative judgment. So the real challenge here with volunteer communities, again, when you talk about these large organizations, they have fully paid staff who are full-time, they have lawyers, they have investigators. They still struggle with it, even with all those resources, right? You're a volunteer group. This is I do this job because I love it, but I may not necessarily have a full-time. I may not be getting paid full-time. I may not have resources. Do I need to be worried about legal retaliation, right? This is why I wanted to spend this time today with SDS. I love what they're doing to provide resources to underserved communities, right? I'm not out there lecturing universities. They've got the budgets for this. What I like to help is groups that need this training, and SDS is a tremendous opportunity to get that training and resources. You don't have to tackle this alone. You're a single shop owner or coach in one studio, and you're like, how do I deal with this? Talk to SDS, get some help. But the other parts, when we talk about barriers to reporting, this fear of retaliation and fear of negative judgment. So fear of retaliation, there's a formal and informal. The formal comes, the larger your organization gets, the more likely you're going to have some sort of rules. The problem is, remember back that demographic, younger members, newer members to that organization, the abuser is likely to be a more established member in that organization. They're going to understand the rules better and can actually subvert the rules to retaliate against people who raise complaints. And it may not be obvious. You didn't get selected for the dance runoff or the dance event. You didn't get the score, or you aren't formally included. This is a form of retaliation, and it's every bit as pernicious as a workplace retaliation. But there's also informal retaliation. Because this dance exists in this social network, in misinformation, gossip, the rumor chain, right? That is very, very difficult when it comes to retaliation, because it's not just my coworkers now. These are my friends. If I'm making an accusation and half my friends are going to go with the accuser and half of them are going to, or a quarter of them are going to go with me and a quarter are going to stay silent, that's a huge barrier for whether I want to deal with that and report the misuse I'm seeing. So the retaliation can also come through social. It can also come in negative judgment, right? You have constantly, one of the real challenges of this kind of assault, it's not the strangers. it's not the person at the outskirts of this thing that presents the highest risk. It is the charismatic, high volunteer, embedded in the middle of the organization who everyone likes. And that gives them the access to be the abuser. That's the challenge of these social, and I'm not, again, not everyone in that position is an abuser, but when you look at where the abusers are, they tend to be in these middle to higher ranks. They tend to be well regarded or have some sort of power. That's what gives them the opportunity to gain this power over others. So when you challenge someone like that, you're going to get a negative judgment against you, and you may lose friends, you may lose access to dance studios or other things you've come to rely on. It can be extremely difficult to contemplate this effort of making an accusation, making a complaint, especially if you've seen retaliation and negative judgment. We remember what happened the last time someone tried to do this. And this is where I get really key with organizations to improve their methods, because every incident is not just an opportunity to do the right or wrong thing with that activity or that complaint. It's also going to create a system memory of how people perceive your organization. How do they perceive the attention they pay to this? Will they bring this up in the future, or will they find some other means? So again, these risk factors combine. It's a system of interacting. The community cachet and the high status position may not matter as much if you're a 20-year veteran to the thing. But if you're a newcomer and you see everyone responding and treating to these, or you're maybe a little bit younger and the celebrity effect is playing, these things begin interacting in different ways to create the overall perception of risk. And so again, all of these different risk factors, they're all grounded in research. We have seen them wherever we go. You may have to think how it applies to your dance organization. But if you think about, are these present? These may be things that you can think about. How do I adjust this? And we're going to get in a little bit now, but how does this system unfold, right? These are a bunch of risk factors. How does this system come together? One of the things we often talk about is harassment as a system versus harassment as an incident. It is very culturally prevalent, at least in the United States, where I do most of my work, to think of a bad incident as just an incident. A complaint was filed, someone did something wrong, that's bad. If we're lucky, they think that's bad and they investigate it, but they treat it as a singular incident. What I want you to think about is how these risk factors form in a system of harassment, what we call the system of harassment or the pathway of harassment. So as we go through this diagram, there's going to be two colors I use. Blue, these are the dance spaces. These are the studios, the actual dance floor, the formal events, but then there's also non-dance spaces, the red. These are the areas that are adjacent because of the social organization, the social nature of your community, the social networks. And I think it's really key when we talk about incidents, we tend to get in this mix of, well, it didn't happen on the dance floor, or it didn't happen at an event, it happened in a hotel room. But keep in mind, when people are joining organizations, they are being introduced to both the dance and non-dance spaces through that organization. That means your abusers are also existing within that organization prior to the incident. So how does this unfold, right? The first is the abuser may extensively volunteer. They may dance extensively. They may be, again, it's not the strangers that are lurking on the sides in a trench coat. Power over others comes from time. And typically what we see, and I've done a bunch of investigations on this, I've read a bunch of research, the people who are abusers are somehow actively involved. Now, in other organizations, they may be through money, they may buy their way in, but in volunteer organizations, volunteer is your form of activity, right? So anywhere there's volunteering, and again, not everyone who volunteers is an abuser, but I want to be sure that they may be volunteering, they may be considered a linchpin, they may be considered important for putting on events. This is how you see some of the worst abusers. They get this cachet and celebrity inside the organizations. They gain positions, right? They've proven themselves over time. They've increased their social network. They travel around. Everyone knows them. They've got this. You can begin to see how the power imbalance is beginning, right? They're gaining power in the dance community. Then they identify victims at dance events, right? You've got regular newcomers coming. This is where that demographics come in. You've got regular newcomers coming in. They may be young or part of a vulnerable. That power the abuser has is now formalized or informal. It's strong. And they gain that high profile status where the act of questioning them is going to raise both, who are you to question me, but also amongst all their friends and connections. Well, I know Bob. I've known Bob for 20 years. He would never do anything like that. You know, that's the challenge of these sort of abusive, pervasive risk scenarios, is that often it is someone that everyone likes as a friend. I've had to tell myself, you have to be open that it may be your best friend who is accused, and you have to take that accusation seriously. Unfortunately, myself, I've had friends I've known for 20 years, and somebody said something when I started doing this work, and I thought back and go, you know what? If I objectively heard that about anyone else, it would be a huge red flag. I can't let my friendship diminish that red flag just because they're my friends. That's the challenge of this. That's the challenge of social organizations and social communities. But once they gain that, they have this power. They may begin grooming the victim. Grooming is unfortunately a widely misused term these days. You see it all over social media here. But what I'm saying is they're gaining the access to the individual, and they're gaining the ability to commit the harassment and the toxicity. Depending on the circumstance, this could be minutes, if you're talking about inappropriate touches on the dance floor to strangers, or it could be over months. But this grooming is basically preparing the victim for the assault, and the harassing behavior escalates. Very rarely do you have an incident and you go back and it came out of the blue. There was a behavior of escalation that was missed by the organization. Now they commit the assault. And I put these in red because a lot of times they're not stupid. They're not going to do this necessarily in the most public place where everyone's watching. They're going to do it somewhere that's a non-dance space. And you see this come up all the time. We're an event. Why should we regulate what people do in their private lives? We don't want to police what they do in their private lives. We don't want to be, I understand that. I get that. I am very empathetic to that overall. But understand, the abuser and the victim only came together because of the community you created. So if your abusers are using your system, you have to take an obligation if they then use that system to then go commit an assault, even if it's not at your location. Because they're going to start using that informal social network to silence their victims. As soon as they commit the assault, the silencing process begins. That social network, that power, that cachet, that celebrity, they may spread around rumors. They may try and protect themselves by setting the narrative early. Even after the event, the incident, things continue. They may start stalking them offline or in real life, in person. They will begin using the formal rules of the organization to silence their office, their power, right? They may even threaten silencing through legal actions. We see this very frequently where they'll and it's not exactly a clear-cut case, the legal things, and it really varies by country, but a lot of times the threat, if this person has high access and high power and the other person doesn't perceive themselves as having the resources, they may not want to take on that legal risk. The legal threat may not come to the person they abused, but the organization investigating them. Who are you to accuse us? I'm going to sue you for libel or something like that. Small studios may not have the resources, right? So think about this. The assault may have taken place off-site, but they're definitely using the organization and the community to continue the assault and harassment. And then finally, they repeat the pattern of behavior. This is the thing that's really important. When we think about it as an incident, we tend to think, well, that was just a one bad apple. That was a one-off. Okay, we got it. We dealt with this person and it won't happen again. But the trick is that this is repetitive pattern. And I see this over and over again in my research. This system of harassment becomes self-sustaining. They go through these cycles and they begin, they get away with it once, or let's put it this way. If you hear of one, there's probably three. If you hear of three, there's probably seven. If you hear of seven, there's probably dozens. And that's because people aren't always willing to come forward. So if you hear of one complaint, think in your head that there may be more than just one, because this has probably been going on and there are probably people not willing to come forward. So the other thing that happens as a natural reaction is the whisper network forms. Those of you who may have heard this phrase, the whisper network. This is the informal discussion where people say, hey, don't let so-and-so alone in a room with Bob. Don't let so-and-so in this area. Or watch yourself around this. And these whisper networks form amongst the social connections. But if you're new, if you just join the organization, you're still feeling yourself out, you don't have that whisper network, it can get really tricky because you may not be connected to the warning system. And these whisper networks form when formal action isn't taken. They're sort of a byproduct effect. So right before we get into the break, I want to, because we're going to take a break here in a second. Where do communities recognize this risk, right? Take a step back, put yourself, where do you think of that these conversations have come up? most times, right? Most times where it comes up is when an incident happens, right? And this is sort of the challenge of this incident versus system perspective, is that most of the time when the incident comes up, if we're lucky, that's why there's a question mark there. They may not recognize the risk. They may just blow it off. Well, that was a one-off, or there was alcohol involved, or it happened in a hotel room and it's he said, she said. We don't really understand. Even if they recognize that risk, hey, this was really bad, this is serious, they think it occurs here. But when you think of risk as a system, right, the actual risk was generating all along. The risk actually emerges in the community in all of these activities to the left. So remember that balance I showed? As you accept risk on the left, your obligation to act goes up on the right. That's because this is operating as a system. All of these activities have to occur before that one bad incident. So the risk itself is occurring constantly. And if you aren't out there and looking for it and assessing it and putting in place measures to reduce it or minimize it, then you're going to be getting that accelerating risk, that accumulating risk that's going to end up in a bad incident. And you're going to be back in this spot where you say, hey, something bad happened. Well, let's focus on that area where the bad thing happened, or on the one person. But what you need to look at is everything that led up to that, because that's where the community often plays the biggest role, is in preventing this ahead of time, cutting it off at the pass. And that's where SDS has, I'm so thrilled to be working with them, because they provide these tools that aren't just like something bad happened, what do we do now? It's, hey, how do we address this as a system or as a pathway? So we've just hit you with a lot of information. There's been a lot of details coming up. Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to get into the back half of the discussion. So this is where we're going to pause. When we come back, we're going to take a look at systemic predators and how they form. And so I'm showing 11:50 Eastern, which I believe is 4:50 BST. So let's come back around 4:55, 4:56, get yourself a cup of coffee, stretch your legs, go to the restroom if you need. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Tim?
Yes.
So before we go, can I ask if people do have any questions so they just don't forget it? You can put it in the chat as well, and then we can pick them up when we start at the break.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. So 16:55 British summertime, 55 past the hour. See you soon.